Ollie, probably one of the best cats ever. Hello, gorgeous. Yeah? Hi folks and welcome back. When I was 19, my first business collapsed. A lack of forward planning and a young age meant that I'd failed to forecast or be prepared for a quiet time in the year. It was a moment of fantasy dreams meeting reality and coming to a crashing stop. And I took the opportunity to take one of the many government schemes that were available at the time to retrain. I took computing. This new thing that every business was going to have in their offices. And as with all these schemes, you had to do a work placement. Mine was with Durham County Ambulance Service, known as DCAS. And I was to be placed for 6 months in the Manpower Planning Unit. The first thing I did was to get a haircut. At the time, I could sit on my hair. The denim jacket, covered in patches, was put away, and the studded belt and wrist cuff were also put away. Overnight, I became what most people called respectable. Don't get me wrong, I still listened to heavy metal music. I still didn't give a fig what people thought about me. I knew what I was worth, which in my mind was not a lot at that time. The ambulance service gave me a lot. For starters, it gave me a home, a chance to see some worth in myself. It gave me a realisation that as much as I had a passion for working outdoors, I loved caring for people more. Being part of a team that can make a person's life better was so rewarding. The ambulance service gave me some of the best parts of my life and the reason behind some of the lowest, darkest moments. Like the night, 2 years into my service, driving a doctor, that we responded to a man in his mid-50s with indigestion, tightness in breathing, and just not feeling well. It's called a heart attack. The ambulance was going to be around half an hour at least, and probably longer, given their run time. We set off into the freezing conditions of that February night, with snow and black ice being the least of my stresses as I tried to get there as quickly and safely as possible. As we rounded a corner of an S-bend, to our left was a car in a field. It had ploughed through the remains of a dry stone wall and a fence. The lights were on and the engine was running. Stopping the car, the cold and silence settled over us, and training started to take over as the true horror of what had happened became apparent. It was my first fatal crash that I attended, and one that still wakes me most nights. It has been the background reason for my attempt at suicide, and 2 more moments of what they call crisis. It's also the reason that I've chosen over the last 5 years to rebuild myself, facing the fact that that night we couldn't save one life, but did save another. But what is the history behind the ambulance? Where did it all begin? And maybe an understanding of what we're talking about here. I'm not talking about field surgeons or hospitals. Both of those laurels can be laid at the doors of the Roman army and the Knights of St. John, known as the Knights Hospitallers. We're talking about the transport to get injured from the battlefield to a place of healing. The earliest of which go back to how the Normans used a litter suspended by 2 poles between horses. This A-frame system was not new even then, and had been used before, but it's just that we have evidence of it being used. The Anglo-Saxons used a cart with a wooden bed removed and a hammock slung to carry wounded. Carts of various types were used right up to the 20th century, and it's only the invention of the internal combustion engine that has replaced them. The first organised evac of any battlefield was in the reign of Queen Isabella I of Castile around 1490. The Spanish army relied on mercenary troops, and one of the motivations was the promise of swift removal from the battlefield to a hospital if you were injured. When the term swift is used here, Normally you had to wait until the battle was over, which of course meant that you might well have bled to death, and swift is relative to the form of transport being used to get you to the hospital. The important bit was that this, along with being well paid, was one of the motivators for the forces as they fought against the Moors from the Emirate of Granada, an Islamic kingdom in southern Iberia, now southern Spain. Casualties were taken to military hospitals called ambulancias. The name would stay long after the event. It's not until the French Revolutionary Wars that we see the dedicated vehicle appear. And this was down to a military surgeon, a man who unwittingly would go on to save untold lives, whose understanding of the need to get a casualty to the loving care of a field surgeon. Dominique Jean Loret. In 1789, Citizen Loret was involved in the storming of the Bastille as a surgeon, and he improvised an ambulance to help treat the wounded. It was this basis that in 1792, now a surgeon in the French army, that he insisted on modernising the army's organisation of field hospitals and surgery. This one person set in place the beginning of modern military medical principles for the next nearly 250 years. He introduced triage, regardless of rank or nationality, which translates from French as sorting. He reorganised field hospitals, improving on their mobility and organisation, in effect creating the basis for the modern Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, or MASH. The work that helped the welfare of soldiers the most, though, is undoubtedly his creation of the fast ambulance. The ambulance volante, or flying ambulances. While Loret's design was a huge leap forward, the American Rucker ambulance, named after Major General Rucker, was a better design than the previous option. Along with the Rucker ambulance, the American Civil War saw the introduction of patients being moved by rail for the first time, and steamboats being used as the first dedicated hospital ships. The First World War saw the introduction of the first military internal combustion engine powered ambulance on the chassis of the Model T Ford, with a top speed of around 50 miles per hour, and good cross-country abilities. For the time, it was a huge hit. Survivability for soldiers was improving. At least if the bullet didn't kill you, you had more chance of surviving the knife. And the military ambulance certainly improved your odds of getting you to hospital alive. The Second World War saw 3 vehicles rise to the challenge and more than meet it. The British Austin K2Y, the American Dodge half-ton, and the German Opel Blitz. These 3 vehicles and their brave crews helped save the lives of so many troops while regularly under fire from enemy forces. The military ambulance was here to stay. It improved its place in life and its ability to help save others. And military principles had changed. No longer were we going to throw bodies into the breach and just accept the losses. The modern army would get you into harm's way fast, but would also try to get you out. In an age where the helicopter is used mainly for the evac of casualties from the battlefield, it might seem that the battlefield ambulance has no place. But this is not the case. The American Humvee, Mercedes-Benz Unimog, and the humble but trustworthy Land Rover Battlefield Ambulance still have their place. Their 4x4 ability to go just about anywhere is almost legendary. And as long as our ability to harm, maim, and injure each other continues, their never-ending need to be ready will always be there. When I was building this model, I had wondered why it was included in the set. After all, I realised there was probably a better choice. But now I'm not so sure. This set came out in 1970, and a lot of what we see on the battlefield now has changed in that intervening 50 years. The command and control vehicles that we now have weren't there then. I'm not saying that we didn't have them, but their roles were different. And in some ways, the idea of the go anywhere rescue vehicle has a certain appeal. And it did build a nice, albeit simple model. The door's a pain to get to work correctly, but then again, I do love the tinkering side of the hobby. And some 30 years ago, I can remember looking at a Land Rover ambulance and thinking, what a wonderful vehicle to convert and live in. Funny to think then that van life as we know it didn't exist. And the thought of living in one was considered an act of lunacy by my father. But then it was just after the time of the travellers in the UK. Greenham Common and C&D were still hot topics in the news, as were people living in converted vehicles of all types. And no doubt he would have thought that I was going to go and join in. Well, now the idea of living in a converted ambulance is not seen as strange at all. In fact, most people, to some degree or another, understand the idea of taking off, just going somewhere, anywhere but here. And I wonder what LeRae would think of where his groundbreaking work has got us. The modern actual flying ambulance would probably leave him in shock. But our ability to get wounded to medical care, and how good that medical care is now, might leave him with some satisfaction at what his work began.